Welcome to Self-Publishing with ALLi from the Alliance of Independent Authors. This week, it's our advice stream focusing on editing and design. Discover how you can apply best practices in these first stages of the publishing process to ensure the excellence of your work and its ability to appeal to your target readership. This Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast is sponsored by Book Vault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalty selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with Book Vault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. This podcast is also sponsored by Gatekeeper Press, the all-inclusive gold standard in publishing, offering authors 100% rights, royalties, satisfaction, and worldwide distribution. Gatekeeper Press, where authors are family. And here's your host for the Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast, ALLi Campaigns Manager, Matty Dalrymple.
Hello, everyone. I am Matty Dalrymple. I am the Campaigns Manager for ALLi, and I am here today with Michael Pietrobon. Hey, Michael, how are you doing?
I'm very well, Matty. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you. And to give our listeners a little bit of background on you, Michael Pietrobon is the founder of Foglio, a Canadian company specializing in high-quality book design and self-publishing services. With over a decade of experience in typesetting, cover design, and ebook formatting, Michael helps authors bring their books to life professionally and on their own terms. And we're going to be talking today about budget-friendly ways of incorporating audio into ebooks. And over the last couple of episodes of the Editing and Design podcast, we've been talking about audiobooks, like editing considerations for when you're producing an audiobook. But this is really more focused on audio components of ebook. And in some of our earlier conversations, you had talked about how these could play out in children's books, but are there opportunities for the things we're going to be talking about to play out in books for adults as well?
Oh, certainly. So, big stumbling block with audio narration of books in general are things like dialogue tags or how you might format different parts of the text differently. Like if you're changing the perspective from first to third person, that sort of thing. We can do this with certain sound effects, or my favorite way of approaching this is through leitmotifs, which if you've ever watched Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, it's a particular sound or melody that plays when a certain character or theme or setting is introduced. And the way that we would incorporate this is by use of just a little sound effect. And you can find so many free sound effects online. It's really not something that needs to break the bank. That would relate to a particular character. So rather than saying, this character said, that character said, and so on, you would just use these little tags, these leitmotifs, which would give a little more texture to the text. And this works really well for children's books. I've worked on a number of children's books that incorporated audio in the ebook version, and they use this to great effect, and children love it. But it could also work just as well for general fiction, fantasy, any other genre, really.
And so using a children's book as an example, because I think it will be clearer for me there, and then we can generalize more to adult books, is the scenario where a child would be reading a book on an e-reader, and they would, let's say, turn the page, or they would come to an illustration, and it was the illustration of the frog or whatever. And so there would be some sound associated with the frog character that was independent of the content in the page. So it wouldn't be like voicing any of the text the way we normally think of as an audiobook, but maybe the frog lives in a swamp, and so every time there's a frog character, some swampy sound happens. Is this a legitimate example of what you're talking about?
That's a perfect example, actually, and I might use it. In that particular case, I would say, as the focus of our discussion is more budget-friendly options that authors can employ, you can have the author themselves narrating this book entirely, and they may not be the most skilled in voice acting and acting out these different parts or voicing these different parts. That leitmotif, that little sound effect, will do a lot of the heavy lifting and make it seem as though there is some differentiation, even though it is the same person, probably in the same sort of tone of voice reading the text. So that's a great approach, and that's exactly how I would go about it.
So I had another question about distinguishing this from audiobooks, because once you start talking about an author narrating themselves or, voicing characters and things like that, now my mind immediately goes to what I think all of us think of as audiobooks. So can you just describe a little further about if the child's reading the book about the frog in the swamp on the e-reader, how do these considerations like the voicing of the characters enter into this short of it becoming an audiobook?
Well, there are always limitations with ebooks in that at the very bare minimum, you have to have text on a page. Many e-readers do not allow the incorporation of any audio or any multimedia functionalities at all. But when you're thinking in particularly these of children's books, where most of the time, most children, at least in Canada and North America in general, have an iPad or access to a fairly modern tablet. If they're reading an ebook, it would be on one of those devices rather than a black and white Kindle device. These devices all have that functionality built in. So to answer your question about how it might be distinguished, an audiobook in particular, this would be a digital format of the book that has audio as an augmenting feature. So audio would not be the primary focus, whereas in an audiobook, of course, the audio is of primary importance. So these ebooks, a reader could get just as much out of it just by reading the book and never playing the audio.
Yeah, one of the ways that I thought this might play out for an adult book, for my book, in fact, it was a challenge I had faced with the production of the audiobook, not the kind of augmented ebook that you're talking about here, but I think there's some applicability because in one of my series, the protagonist can read people's minds. And so I would indicate on the page in print or an ebook when she was hearing someone's thoughts in her head, I would indicate it in italics. And when it came time for my audiobook narrator to narrate that, we sort of struggled with how we were going to go about that. You know, we talked about, do we make some kind of sort of like echoey sound for that part of the text? What she ended up doing was just periodically inserting phrases like, you know, she sensed his thoughts or whatever, which, you know, was an acceptable solution. But I can imagine that in the ebook, getting back to what we're focusing on, it would be cool to have maybe a slightly different, like that sound play, like when you're entering into a part of dialogue that is hearing thoughts rather than hearing spoken words, that could play out there.
So you bring up a great point, and sort of related to this, I'd like to point out that, you know, many audiobooks seem to omit footnotes and endnotes, which, you know, if it's just a citation, it doesn't really matter. But if it's actually information that supports the text in a meaningful way, that's just meant to be an aside, omitting that seems like a serious misstep because we want to maintain as much fidelity to the text as possible. So I've thought of many different ways of doing this. And, you know, you could have a leitmotif for endnotes, for example, or footnotes, and have maybe like an ascending scale of 3-note sound, ascending to start the end note and then descending to end the end note, so that the listener or the reader would know that this is separate from the main text. And all of these things can be demarcated early on in the book, just to say, when this sound plays, this is what's happening. And regarding your example with your book, honestly, that my first thought was to do something like that. If I were thinking of a solution with some kind of echoey sound, I would hesitate to do anything that would endanger the fidelity of the text in the audiobook version, because you want basically a level playing field with anyone who's reading the book in any format, right? You want the same text, ideally. Other leitmotifs, that, especially if this is something that's employed often throughout the book, maybe like whispering sound, something a little more ethereal, or even just a sound that signifies this break in the narrative at the very start and then exiting it at the very end. There are many ways to approach this.
So I think it might be helpful to understand a little bit more the mechanics of how this works because, you know, again, thinking of an ebook experience rather than an audiobook experience, you would want the sounds to come in appropriately. Like if you start the chapter with a frog in the swamp, you can have the swamp noises like through the chapter. But if you're having something very specific, like I'm trying to set off a footnote or I'm trying to set off an indication that now she's hearing someone's thoughts, not hearing their spoken words, then it has to trigger at a very specific point, and as someone scrolls through the ebook. So can you describe what is the technology that authors would use in order to incorporate these kinds of leitmotifs into their ebooks?
Well, you'd be sort of limited with the reading technology, because as far as I know, there's no really common method for having an audiobook and ebook read at the same time, at the same pace. There are programs that do this, but generally, if someone's reading an ebook, it's on their phone or tablet or a Kindle, and that's very distinct from the audio version. So the reason I would use audio as a way of enhancing the ebook and not as a primary function of the ebook or the enhanced ebook, is that you would not have, like, if you have a wall of text, you would not be necessarily narrating that whole thing. You might have aspects of it. This works really well for poetry. Have a single poem on one page of the ebook, and you have the author reading it or a narrator reading it in a recording. You can use that as a reference for the use of meter when you're doing your own reading. It's this kind of thing that you might read multiple times. Similarly, for a children's book where all the text would sort of appear on the same page, if they turn to a particular page, they would click that button right away. It's the first thing they would do. So they click the button, there's a little bit of a delay, and then the text will appear one line at a time. So that's one way around it. But I'd like to emphasize the fact that what I'm presenting is not really through composed, full narration of the ebook. It would be incorporating other elements that would augment the experience.
And would it always be triggered by the reader clicking a button on their iPad or whatever device they're reading on?
Yes. So validation and compliance with W3C standards, what used to be IDPF standards, is of a primary concern, as well as accessibility with screen readers and other assistive technologies. So one limitation that we've run into is the fact that audio cannot play automatically when you get onto a page. You have to actually press a button, and it has to be a deliberate action in that sense. Now, you can make the button look a little more thematically related to the artwork of the book. You can design that any way you want, but generally, it has to be a button that you actually press. It can't be automatic.
I can imagine a fun way of using this at chapter breaks. Like, I'm thinking of fantasy. You had mentioned that kind of example earlier, that maybe the beginning of every chapter would have this button, maybe in the shape of some, rune or something that was appropriate for the circumstance. And then you click on it and you get, maybe a little bit of music or a little bit of background, the appropriate background noise, the noise of the swamp or whatever. That could be a fun way to set the stage for readers in an audio way, even if they are mainly in the ebook.
I'm taking notes. I love these ideas you're coming up with. Really great. Now that you mentioned fantasy, actually, that's a great segue into another point I wanted to make, which was, again, it doesn't need to be a full narration of the book, because that's what the audiobook is for. That's a separate medium entirely. But it would be really helpful for many readers to have, say, a fantasy book that has a lot of strange character names, a lot of world building that people may not know how to pronounce. Just having a guide of you as the author reading that at the very start of the book would just level up the game for you tremendously, I would say. And other little factors, like, one thing that comes to mind is David Goggins, I think it was his most recent book, Can't Hurt Me, the audiobook version. And this was a pure audiobook, but it was not just the audiobook narrated by a narrator. It was that. And then at the end of every chapter, it was him, David Goggins, and his co-writer, Adam Skolnick, basically doing a little podcast reflecting on that chapter. So again, you can have the ebook as, this is the text that's presented. And then at the very end, to mark the end of the chapter, a little bit of a reflection on maybe why you wrote this chapter. If it's nonfiction, some of the research that led to the writing of this chapter, or maybe a conversation with your co-writer. The possibilities are endless. And I would also add that this is not limited to the ebook. How, you might ask? You can't put audio in a print book. By the use of QR codes, right? It's very simple. My son is taking piano lessons, and I bought a book of sheet music for him, very straightforward stuff. And it has a QR code on every song that he's meant to learn, that I scan it with my phone, and I'm able to listen to it so he can hear it before he actually plays it, right? Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't shut the door to that possibility of adding that in the print version as well. Just a very subtle, simple QR code at the very end.
I can imagine a variation of that would be, actually, it might not even be a variation, sending people to, like, let's say your website. You have a page on your website that specifically the author notes for such and such book.
Right.
And then you have the text of that, you're sending them to your website, and then you have this opportunity, another opportunity to engage with them more than just having them be an anonymous reader of your book. That's a very cool idea. And I can imagine even, I think this would quickly become intrusive depending on how it was used. But especially with a children's book or, even like a middle grade book or something like that, you could have something that would say, she walked through the darkened woods, and you could have that highlighted in some way. I imagine that you could click on it. Now you get like owl sounds or something like that, that the text that was describing things that could be represented in audio format would be clickable if the reader chose to do that. And then it would have that extra layer of experience.
Well, I've taken another note, Matty. That's another great idea. Again, we're somewhat limited with ebooks. And, this is a great time to bring up the distinction between reflowable and fixed layout ebooks. A reflowable ebook is just simply going to be more compatible with more devices. The text flows. It's easy for these devices to process, no matter how old they are, really. But something like what you just described could be possible with a fixed layout ebook, where you would basically have the text hyperlinked, and you can even animate it in such a way that like a kid reading the book could not help but click it because they want to know what happens. They can sort of sense that there's something there. That's a fantastic idea. And you can even have it in such a way that you'd have a recording per line of text. I'd be a little concerned about the size of this file by the end of it, but I mean, that's certainly a possibility with, a certain selection of the text.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. You had earlier mentioned IDPF standards. Can you describe what those are?
So your listeners might have a word of correction for me, but it used to be called IDPF, I believe. I believe I'm correct in saying that, which was the international sort of governing body that put out the standards for EPUB. So EPUB 2, EPUB 3, and so on. I believe that's recently, in the last few years, been taken over by W3C, which is another organization that oversees these kinds of standards and websites and how these things are meant to work. So validation is an important part of any ebook. And, many authors can easily, if they're working on their manuscript in InDesign, export an EPUB. It might be validated when they export. Most often it's not. It's full of errors. You can work through them with these different tools that like Calibre or Sigil to correct these errors. But by and large, it's something that turns into a very overwhelming task for most authors, and they prefer to just have a professional like us take care of that.
So if an author is working on a book where they're intrigued by the, click the rune at the beginning of the chapter, or, have swamp noises when the frog shows up, what would they do in order to lay the groundwork for that? Would they mark up their manuscript in a certain way? Would an author be responsible for finding the sounds that they want to play? Or obviously, if they're recording the text for like an author's note, they would do that. But do they need to find the swamp noise if they want to include that in their book?
Not necessarily. I mean, when I do a project like this with an author, I typically take on most of that work myself, sourcing the audio. I will need some kind of description of what's going on because, I'm not able to read most of the books that I work on. I just simply don't have the time. So a brief overview of the core themes, if there are certain leitmotifs that should be employed, what those might be. If there's a fairy in a book, maybe a little bit of a sprinkling sound, something that sounds like fairy dust, right? And so on. So I would need some guidance from the author, but I would also source all of that audio myself and compile everything together. Another thing is if the author wants to narrate themselves, I always welcome that. I don't think anyone knows the text better than the author. So they would, lend these very special qualities to a reading of the text. In many cases, authors, are not well equipped with the latest and greatest audio recording technology. And now in the age of AI, that's not really a problem. So I would hesitate for any author to use an AI voice to record the text of their book. I mean, it's just going to sound like any other TikTok or Instagram reel, and it's going to lack that depth that a human would bring to it. However, there are AI tools that'll clean up the audio. So you could record something on your phone, which is already pretty good as a microphone for many uses. Adobe has a speech enhancement thing that you can use. It's entirely free. You don't even need an Adobe account, as far as I know. Drag and drop your audio files in there, and it comes out perfectly clean. And it's your voice. It just takes out the background noise. So what we see now with these nation technologies is a great democratizing of the playing field, that really any author can enter the market with as much sophistication and refinement as someone from any major publisher, which is a great benefit.
Yeah, and I like that something like recording your author's notes is much more manageable. Like at one time, I thought I was going to self-narrate one of my nonfiction books, and I quickly realized that after like 15 minutes, my voice is just shot. And so it either would have this unfortunate like deterioration in quality for the 15 minutes, and then I'd take a break, and then it would sound fine again. Or I had to record in very, very small chunks. I never made that audiobook. But if it's just an author's note, it's much more manageable. The editing that a person would want to do themselves is much more manageable if it's only a couple of minutes of audio rather than, the hours that a full ebook can be. If someone is, let's say someone is writing in Scrivener or, even Word, the common apps are that people are using to write, then I'm imagining that in order to incorporate this technology and comply with the standards you mentioned, that you'd be either the author themselves or a professional that they're working with would be using a different tool like Calibre to create it. So once that happens, once a file is created that incorporates the audio, does the author have the ability to change text? Like if they found a typo, would they then need to be fixing the typo both in their non-audio version and in the audio version? Could they do that themselves? How would that work?
Yeah, so for all intents and purposes, they would be completely different files. They would work differently. They would have different scripts that would run the audio, and any other animations that would be part of this augmented audio or ebook version. Every file would have to be edited separately. And when you start incorporating multimedia, audio, fillable forms, videos, any really interactive elements in your ebook, it's going to be a challenge, I think, for most authors to take this on their own, because as soon as you start introducing some JavaScript or anything like that, HTML is easy enough for many people to get a firm grasp on with, maybe within an hour's time, especially if the book is just mostly text and you just have paragraph tags. If it's anything more complicated than that, I would seriously consider, enlisting the help of a professional. And it doesn't have to be something that's very costly. If you can do a lot of the recording on your own and really prepare things adequately for your designer, they'll have an easier time. And usually that translates to fewer dollars spent, right?
Yeah. Can imagine one thing that people would be tempted to do is to have a song play. So, the protagonist walks into a bar and in the background, the Beatles' Let It Be was playing. And someone's going to say, oh, what would be super fun for them to click a button and please let it be. So I'm going to guess that that's just not a good idea for many reasons, including like lawsuits. So do you have any advice about, as people are thinking through the types of sounds that they could incorporate into their ebooks, where should they draw the line? Are there resources available that they might not be thinking of?
Oh, yeah. There are plenty of websites that have royalty-free audio. So there's royalty-free music available. If you're writing a book that's set 100 years in the past, you can probably find relevant music that's in the public domain. Plenty of royalty-free recordings on there as well of classical Baroque music. And they're older recordings. So, in some cases that might give your book a little more flair than just like a crisp and clean modern recording in the first place. I would distinguish audio that's free to use for social media and audio that's free to use for something that's being sold, like an enhanced ebook, right? So you'd want to be careful about that. On the other hand, these recordings do not have to be limited to the ebook. These would think of if you wrote a collection of poetry, right? You've got 30 poems in your book and you've recorded each of them for this enhanced ebook. It doesn't need to be limited to just that medium. You can use those recordings for social media posts, repurpose it, and make it new every single time. So it doesn't have to just live in that vacuum of the ebook, which a great benefit of having this in your back catalog, right?
Yeah, and I can imagine also that, a lot of people will be writing a book that is let's say, about based on their experience of going to Block Island for the summer or something like that. And so probably the safest audio, I imagine, although perhaps not the highest quality, is to record the environment you're in when you are where the character would be. So you're at the beach and, just as recording your voice into a phone can be pretty good, recording ambient sounds into your phone could be pretty good. And you could use that. And now you have the rights to it because you're the creator of the content.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's another great idea of just having ambient sound. It doesn't have to be any narration at all. Like imagine you get to the start of a chapter in an ebook that takes place in, in the East Coast of the United States, and, there's waves lapping the shore and that sort of thing. Having a recording of that playing, very gently while someone's reading a book that takes place in that setting, it would do wonders for many readers. And these are the kinds of things that would encourage someone to recommend your book to other people, right? You want to find distinguishing features that would set your book apart from everyone else. Of course, the text is of primary importance and it needs to be a well-written book, but these other factors actually do play into it as well.
Yeah, I think anything that is bringing in different senses, sometimes there'll be the angle of somebody will mention, I do this myself, they'll mention a website in the book, but then if you go to that website, it's actually a website. And it's fun when you blur the lines between just reading words on a page and you introduce other senses and other experiences into that. Any other thoughts on interactivity or adding this? I really like the idea of texture, ways to use audio to add texture to books in other formats.
So I would say that as an author, your primary concern should still be the print and then the ebook and then the audiobook version. And then somewhere in between there, the enhanced ebook version, because, as much as we like to say that things are changing and the publishing landscape is nothing like what it used to be, it is remarkably consistent in the fact that print books are still very dominant in the industry, right? So I would say, if you have limited resources and limited funds, pouring more of your effort into good book design, good typesetting, spreads that people actually want to read with their eyes rather than their ears, that is of primary importance. And you don't need to go to a professional narrator, a full cast recording of the audiobook when that does not usually account for as many sales as the print version. And instead, you can find a way to make a more interactive version, an audio-friendly version that doesn't break the bank, right? So that's something I'd be concerned about. And then another point of concern is the validation of the ebook. So by all means, try everything that we discussed in this podcast. I would encourage to break these boundaries and try novel things, if you'll pardon the pun. But nonetheless, you want to be sure that this thing actually works and it's validated and it works on multiple devices. The end result is that you're most likely going to have two different versions of the ebook, one that works on simple Kindle e-ink devices, and then one that's more friendly with like iPads, iPhones, computers, and that sort of thing that can handle this multimedia functionality as well.
And one quick question on that. In terms of the actual distribution of these, would authors need to go on different platforms than the standard platforms they would be using to get unenhanced ebooks out? Like, for example, I distribute a lot of my ebooks through Draft Digital. Would I need to go somewhere else to serve the people that were reading on more sophisticated devices and could make use of those enhanced features?
So as far as I know, Draft 2 Digital will push the same version to every retailer, right? So you upload once and it'll push it to whether Overdrive, Hoopla, Kobo, Diesel, Apple Books, all the retailers will get the same treatment. So I don't believe that you can distinguish between different versions in different retailers by uploading through Draft 2 Digital. You may have to go directly through Apple Books for the enhanced version, Kobo for the enhanced version, Google Play, and upload them individually. But there's nothing to stop you from having both versions, right? You can have the straightforward, simple version, maybe for $9.99 on Apple Books, but then the enhanced version for a little bit more, call it a collector's edition. You can give it a slightly different color, different banding on the cover. And yeah, you can have it in both venues, that's for sure. But I believe if you're doing an enhanced version, you would have to upload that separately to those retailers that actually support that functionality.
Yeah, great. Well, Michael, thank you so much. This is an area that I had never heard about, never had a chance to discuss with anyone. So this was super fun and gave me lots of ideas for maybe down the path for my own book. So please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Thank you, Matty. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you. So once again, my name is Michael Pietrobon. I'm founder of Foglio Custom Book Specialists based here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. You can find out more about what we do at foglioprint.com. That's FOGLIOPRINT.com. We help authors at every stage of the publishing process, whether they need editing, typesetting, cover design, ebook design, you name it. We help authors with that.
Great. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the editing and design stream of the Self-Publishing with ALLi podcast sponsored by Book Vault. Sell high-quality print-on-demand books directly to readers worldwide and earn maximum royalties selling directly. Automate fulfillment and create stunning special editions with Book Vault Bespoke. Visit bookvault.app today for an instant quote. This podcast is also sponsored by Gatekeeper Press, the all-inclusive gold standard in publishing, offering authors 100% rights, royalties, satisfaction, and worldwide distribution. Gatekeeper Press, where authors are family. And if you haven't already, we invite you to join our organization and become a self-publishing ally. You can do that at allianceindependentauthors.org.